The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers.
Hello, everyone. It's almost here. Just 9 days until the Whitehall Sasquatch Festival, and I'm so excited. So if any of you wanderers plan on going, make sure you stop by our booth and say hello.
Yeah, and while you're looking at all the Bigfoot stuff, the photos and footcast, and in between the experts giving presentations, wander on by and say hello.
We'd love to meet you.
That we would. It'd be nice to put some faces to our listeners.
That would be cool.
That's it for the housekeeping this week.
Short and sweet.
Got anything else?
Nope.
Alrighty then, let's get into it. Let's see where Beth's mind wandered for this episode.
Well, in 2021, 5.2 million people visited the 21 Smithsonian Museums in Washington, D.C. And this number is actually pretty low because in the years before the pandemic, it was closer to 9 million people. As museum goers walk the many, many halls, looking at 157 million artifacts, from moonlanders in the Air and Space Museum to one of Martha Washington's gowns, or even Archie Bunker's worn armchair from the TV show All in the Family in the American History Museum, there is more than enough to see. In fact, it's quite impossible to see it all. Apparently, if you spent 1 minute at each exhibit, it would take you more than 258 years to see it all.
Well, how do they expect you to cover all that territory in one lifetime?
You can't.
I guess you got to just hone in on what you like and go from there.
Yes. But when the day ends and weary visitors head out the exits, the museum goes peacefully quiet. Perhaps all you hear is the lone footsteps of a security guard making his or her rounds. Or perhaps there are still 1 or 2 employees in the archives finishing up their research. It's in these quiet hours when the 5 ghosts of the Smithsonian are said to emerge from the shadows. Although, if you ask, the staff representing the face of the museum will tell you it's all imagination and rumor. But is it?
Well, if you believe that objects can have attachments, then yes. Plus, a haunting doesn't have to be something evil. It can be something good also. Some happy moments attached to an object.
Or the people who work there and spent a lot of time there. And I think the 5 ghosts that are said to be there are a mixture of the two. They're connected to the objects or they're connected to the building itself.
You know what I find pretty unbelievable, though, is that there's only 5 ghosts?
Allegedly, yes, there's only 5. In the one building that I'm going to talk about.
In the one building.
Yes. So in 1846, Washington, D.C. held a nationwide building competition open to architects with designs for a new museum. The unanimous winner, James Renwick, Jr., had designed St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. And in 1847, construction of the first museum building, known as the Castle, began. Originally, this first of 21 museum buildings was to be built out of white marble. Then they changed their minds to yellow limestone, before changing their minds again and settling on Seneca red sandstone. Reportedly, each rough-hewn stone that went into the building was created by enslaved people at the Seneca Quarry in Maryland. Both the east and west wings of the castle were completed by 1849, and the very first Smithsonian secretary moved into the east wing with his family in 1855. His name was Professor Joseph Henry. Professor Henry was a science enthusiast, and he actually pioneered experiments that led to the creation of the National Weather Service. But he really didn't like D.C. very much. He complained often in his letters to friends about the incessant swampy heat and poor sanitation. His wife and 4 children left D.C. whenever they could, but Professor Henry stayed behind working in the castle, which he said was like the sides of an oven sufficiently hot enough to cook whatever they may enclose. In 1862, Professor Henry's son William, who worked in the Smithsonian Library, died in the castle unexpectedly after a brief illness. Just 3 years later, in 1865, the castle caught on fire, and a trove of historical artifacts were lost, including 200 of artist John Mick Stanley's paintings and the entire contents of Professor Henry's office, which held all of the documents pertaining to the founding of the museum. Other scientific papers were lost as well. In fact, the entire second floor was beyond saving. But despite personal loss and a great dislike for Washington, D.C.'s climate, it seems as though Professor Henry has stuck around in his former office and home since his death in 1878. As early as 1900, night watchmen began seeing what they could only assume was his ghost. They described a man in a frock coat, starched white collar, and cravat wandering the halls at night. Each time they'd try to catch up with him, it was as if he simply vanished into solid walls. Or they'd swear that they watched his apparition exit the building and approach the statue of himself in the courtyard, and it was almost as if he disappeared into it. I like the way they said it, so I'm just going to quote what they said. They said they'd watch his shade go in and out of the statue.
That is cool.
That is very cool.
His shade.
His shade.
Oh, I love that.
After the devastating fire in 1865, architect Adolf Kluss was hired to renovate the castle. Kluss was a supporter of communism, and he really liked the red sandstone bricks and Gothic architecture, which is why the castle, as it looks today, is a Gothic-style red brick building. Electric lights were installed in 1895. In 1987, an addition was added by using more Seneca red bricks from the demolished Washington, D.C. jail. So, to sum it up, the castle was built using bricks made by enslaved people. There was a fire, which destroyed several historical artifacts, and then it was rebuilt from bricks from an old jail.
Yeah, that's definitely the perfect storm for a haunting.
Definitely. So, James Smithson. Now, he was a pretty interesting guy. Although he was English and his father was an aristocrat, James was born in Paris because his mother was not Mrs. Smithson. He became a chemist and a mineralist, but his experiments were as varied as they come. He studied the chemical makeup of human tears and snake venom. You can't get too opposite than human tears and snake venom. He discovered calamine, which was used to make brass. He explored caves, challenging preconceived ideas about the age of rock. And he found himself in the middle of the French Revolution and then was taken prisoner during the Napoleonic Wars.
So he was a busy guy.
very busy, but he never got married and he never had any children. And in his will, he left all of his money to his nephew as long as his nephew had heirs. If that didn't happen, then Smithson wanted all of his money to go to Washington, D.C. in America, a country he'd never even been to, specifically to fund a museum named after himself. Smithson passed away in Italy in 1829, and his nephew died in 1835, and there were no heirs. And so his money, almost $560,000, came to Washington. But strangely, so did Smithson, literally. The cemetery in Italy where he was buried was slated to be moved in 1905. Alexander Graham Bell got wind of this and decided that rather than chance any mistakes, Smithson's remains really belonged in the museum. So in 1905, Bell and his wife traveled to Italy, watched as Smithson's remains were exhumed, and then traveled with them back to D.C., where Smithson was reburied in the basement of the castle.
That's awesome.
It is cool. Perhaps Smithson's spirit just wanted to see what his money had built. Or perhaps he searches for the several personal objects that also reside in the castle, because an apparition, which many employees swear is of him, has been seen there since 1905. A third man, said to still walk the halls of the castle 138 years after his death, is the museum's first curator, Spencer Fullerton Baird. Baird was a naturalist, ornithologist, ichthyologist, and herpetologist.
Wow, it does all sound pretty icky. A herpetologist, itchyologist.
Ichthyologist.
Yeah, I don't know where this is going, but
I had to look some of them up, I'll be honest. So he was an expert in birds, fish, amphibians, and reptiles.
I see.
When he arrived in D.C., he brought along 2 boxcars filled with his own collection. Baird was so dedicated to the Smithsonian that he increased the specimens housed at the museum from just 6,000 to over 2 million. But he also worked on a sort of lending library or exchange system, which other scientists around the world could borrow scientific papers from. Just like Professor Henry, Baird was offered the castle to live in, but instead he had the east wing converted into more workspace, and he installed a newfangled invention, the telephone. One night watchman at the Smithsonian claimed to see the ghost of Spencer Fullerton Baird on a nightly basis. And just like Professor Henry and James Smithson's apparitions, Baird's ghost would disappear as soon as the watchman got too close. Polar explorer Emil Bessel has been spotted at the museum, too. Bessel got into a little trouble when he joined the United States North Polar Expedition as the ship's physician in 1871. He didn't get along very well with the expedition commander, Charles Francis Hall, but when Hall got sick, Bessel treated him. However, when Hall died, Bessel and the remaining crew were questioned. Bessel said he hadn't done anything wrong, and he had done his best to save Hall's life. However, when Hall's remains were exhumed in 1969, lethal amounts of arsenic were found in his system. So, despite whether or not Bessel had poisoned his captain, he worked at the Smithsonian for a while, hoping to publish his scientific papers, including proof that Greenland is an island. Only the first volume of his work was published. He'd planned on publishing 3, and it was later shoved under the rug when that first volume was found to be filled with all kinds of errors. There are several objects in the Smithsonian that are connected to Bessel, including photographs, one of which is Bessel wearing a very, very impressive fur coat, and artifacts like Eskimo lamps and spearheads. Perhaps Bessel's spirit is tied to one of these objects, or maybe his spirit is restless because his remaining 2 volumes were lost in yet another fire in 1885. Regardless, his spirit is reportedly spotted wandering the halls along with the other gentlemen that I've mentioned. And lastly, there's paleontologist Fielding B. Meek. Meek was a pretty eccentric character who lived in tiny rooms under the grand staircase of the museum with his cat.
Okay, that's creepy.
That he lived in tiny rooms under the stairs?
Yeah.
Or with his cat?
Well, not with his cat, but, living in tiny little rooms underneath the stairs. It reminds me of the horror movie back from, I believe it was the 60s. The People Under the Stairs.
The People Under the Stairs. Well, Meek was part of the Megatherium Club, a group of young scientists. A megatherium, if I'm saying it right, is a giant sloth that lived in South America before it went extinct. Although the Megatherium Club added to the museum's collections, they were considered a pretty rowdy bunch. During the day, they were consummate professionals, but in the evenings, they liked to cut loose with copious amounts of alcohol, lavish dinner parties, and numerous female companions.
Can you imagine partying in the Smithsonian Institute?
I know.
That had to be a ball.
I'd be taking all the artifacts out of the cases and just like holding them and, ooh, I'm going to drop it. Ooh. No, I wouldn't do that. I'd be too afraid of dropping them. After the fire in 1865, Meek moved from beneath the stairs to a small set of rooms on an upper floor.
He's moving on up.
Meek, who had been growing increasingly deaf for some time, died in the castle in December of 1876, and his cat was found by his side.
Oh, that's quaint, isn't it? Did it say whether his cat died along with him, or was his cat still alive?
I don't know, and I wondered the same thing, but that's a good question. It would be creepier if the poor cat had passed away too, but you hear about that.
Well, the creepy thing is that cat had nothing to eat, so I can imagine the condition they found him in.
Oh, gross.
It's true.
With the exception of James Smithson, all 4 of the other men either lived or worked in the castle at the same time. They knew each other quite well. They collaborated and clashed, but they all had the same vision, to make the Smithsonian the greatest museum in the world. Today, it's the biggest museum in the world, literally. But as I mentioned earlier, many people in positions of authority at the Smithsonian will tell you the place is not haunted. They choose to explain away the many sightings by pointing out times when it was proven that what people thought they saw turned out to be something else. For example, Jesse Beach, a paleontologist and museum aide, worked at the Smithsonian for over 20 years, from 1918 to the mid to late 1940s. When she got into her later years, she lived in the Museum of Natural History, and at night she'd wander the halls in her nightgown. With her long white hair and in her nightgown, she frightened quite a few night watchmen who thought that she was a ghost. But Jesse Branch was not a gentleman from the late 1800s. Debunking one watchman's experience doesn't disprove all of the others. Do the 5 men haunt the Smithsonian? I certainly don't know, but is there anything wrong with wanting to believe that these men still walk the halls of the museum they dedicated their lives to? That in the afterlife they continue to meet each other and discuss their discoveries? I actually really like that idea.
Well, these security guards aren't just seeing nothing. They're seeing something. And not only that, but I'd like to look at security footage from the Smithsonian Institute.
That would be cool. I don't think they don't really promote that idea, though, so it'd have to be leaked.
Well, I do like the Smithsonian Institute, but I'm always weary of them because look how many things have been turned into the Smithsonian and all of a sudden, oops, we lost it.
Yeah, we don't know where it went.
Nope. No. Like the red-haired giants, the skeletons that were turned in there.
They went to the Smithsonian?
They did, and they claim they never received them.
Interesting.
Among many other artifacts.
Right.
That were mysterious. But I think they're still wandering around the building. There are people, there are ghosts there.
I hope so. Makes it that much cooler. Hey, did you know? Comedian Jay London once said, "I'm convinced my cockroaches have military training. I set off a roach bomb, they defused it." It's no joke that cockroaches can survive anything, even beheading. Cockroaches can breathe through their pores on all different parts of their bodies. They don't use their mouths to breathe at all. That's why if you cut off a cockroach's head, it can still live for 7 days. Who'da thunk it? Well, Wes, why don't you tell us where your mind wandered this week?
In the year 1691, in Swedish Livonia, which is now part of both modern-day Latvia and Estonia, 80-year-old Thiess of Cattleburn was having a pretty ordinary day. Although he was called in as a witness in a church robbery, he was calm and willing to divulge what he knew about the case. But what he said wasn't exactly what the judges expected to hear. Yes, he knew the suspect, a man named Prison Tonus, but that wasn't who Thiess really wanted to talk about. Instead, he really wanted to talk about himself. For unknown reasons, Thiess straight out informed the judges during his testimony that he was a werewolf. Now, the judges didn't really care at first. Thiess was known around town as being a little nutty, and his werewolf claims didn't have anything to do with the trial. They just wanted to know all that he had seen. But Thiess had other ideas for his captive audience. First of all, he wanted them to know that although he had been a werewolf for many years, he had given it up 10 years earlier. And he said, while he was a werewolf, he was 100% a good werewolf, not the evil kind. Thiess launched into a pretty amazing story about his life as a werewolf, and before long, the judges knew that they had an entirely different kind of case on their hands. A devil worshipper may very well be standing before them, and it was their job to do something about it. And so, they let him talk. Thiess claimed that years earlier, when his life was rough and he lived as a beggar, some rascal had performed some sort of ritual. He said the man had breathed 3 times into a tankard of ale and then said, "You will become like me." The man handed Thiess the tankard, and not wanting to give up some free ale, Thiess drank from the cup, and that was all it took. In fact, that was all it took to turn any man into a werewolf, simply drinking from a cup that another werewolf had breathed into 3 times and proclaimed that you would become like him.
That's pretty unnerving.
It is. Thiess sadly told the judges that he knew he was getting old, but he hadn't been able to find another man who was worthy of taking on the responsibility of werewolfhood. Thiess also stated that this was not his first time appearing in court. A decade earlier, in 1681, he had brought charges against a Lemberg farmer who had broken his nose. When the judges asked how his broken nose was relevant to the case, Thiess informed them that the farmer was actually a devil-worshipping witch, and his broken nose was a result of an altercation between the two of them down in the bowels of hell. Well, as you can imagine, the judges wanted to know more. I mean, who wouldn't? Thiess reiterated that he had always been a good werewolf. In fact, his whole band of werewolves were good. They referred to themselves as hounds of God. They hated the devil with a passion, and since witches were friends of Satan, they detested all witches. The judges were confused and asked how Thiess's nose was broken by a witch in hell if he hated the devil. Why would he even be there in the first place? Thiess had a pretty straightforward answer. He had to go there because he needed to take back what was stolen from the village. All the livestock and the grain that had gone missing, well, the witches had taken it, and it was his duty to go down there and take it all back. Concerned, the judges asked how often this happens. According to the trial transcripts, Thiess replied, quote, "Ordinarily thrice, Pentecost Eve, St. John's Eve, and St. Lucia's Eve." The first two are not always exactly on these nights, but when the grain is blossoming. Then, and at the time of sowing, the sorcerers carry off the yield and therefore carry it into hell. So the werewolves worked hard to bring it back. End quote. If werewolves failed, the harvest would fail. But Thiess also added that he and his fellow werewolves lived off roasted meat, but they didn't have any bread. They needed the stolen grains to make bread, so he had traveled down into hell for two reasons. First, to take back the stolen grains so the village could thrive, but also because he and his brethren wanted bread for themselves. During the fight, the farmer witch had broken his nose with a broom decorated with horsetails. Thiess had been laughed out of court over his broken nose back in 1681, although one judge did note that his nose was definitely broken. He went on to say that just the previous year, he had single-handedly taken back enough barley, oats, and rye to ensure a bountiful harvest. This was the wrong thing to say. The judges immediately pointed out that Thiess had said he had quit the werewolf life 10 years ago. So Thiess was caught in a lie. He reluctantly admitted that he had lied about that, and he was still a werewolf, but he was trying very hard to quit.
How does one voluntarily quit being a werewolf?
Well, he didn't divulge that information.
The only way I know of is a silver bullet, and that's not a voluntary way to quit.
Maybe there's more to it. I don't know. I've never been a werewolf, or have I met one? Out of curiosity, the judges wanted to know how Thiess and his brethren changed from human form into werewolf form. Thiess said it was simple. They just put on wolf pelts that were given to them by local farmers. But he himself had given his pelt away to someone else. When the judges asked him to identify who this farmer was and who he had given his pelt to, Thiess again changed his story. He said that the pelt story was just a story. The truth was that they simply hid behind some bushes, got undressed, and their bodies were transformed into wolves. The transformation made them hungry, so they would travel in a pack from farm to farm, killing livestock. Then they'd roast it and eat it. You know, I can almost see the judges doing a double take before asking, "Wait, you roast the meat first? How do werewolves roast meat exactly?"
That's a good question. You'd think they'd just eat it raw.
You would think so. Thiess had an answer for this, too. He said they were in werewolf form when they killed the animals by ripping them apart. They used their paws to put the meat on spits. Then they transformed back into humans in order to cook the meat. They dined while in human form.
That's a lot of changing back and forth.
Kind of makes sense, you know. You want your meat to have that flavorful, smoky taste to it. The judges backtracked a little and asked how they could steal livestock when they were being guarded by watchdogs. Thiess replied that wolves can outrun dogs.
Well, of course they can.
Then the judges wondered how local farmers weren't complaining about an uptick in missing livestock. Thiess replied that they didn't hunt close to home. He's got an answer for everything.
He does.
He's a remarkable man to me. So it seems as though Thiess had an answer for everything, but the judges persisted. Where was the entrance to hell? Thiess said it was beyond the sea, near a swamp. There was an iron gate that only the werewolves and witches knew about, and if they entered it, it led them down to an underground chamber. Each time the werewolves banded together in order to take back what was stolen, the witches chased them around inside the chamber, beating them with iron rods. Boy, this guy had quite the imagination. I'd love to sit down on a bench and have some ale with him and see where his mind wanders.
Yeah, just don't let him breathe into it 3 times.
Right. One judge wanted to know where the souls of the werewolves went after they died. Thiess answered that they went to heaven, of course. Only witches' souls went to hell. The judge countered that werewolves were also instruments of the devil, and Thiess, offended, repeated that they most certainly were not. They were hounds of God. They only went down into hell temporarily for the good of mankind. Now, needless to say, by this point, the judges had probably forgotten all about the church robbery. Thiess's incredible details about his life as a lycanthropy had them thinking that the man was most likely insane, or at the very least, he had turned away from the Christian faith. They asked him if he attended church regularly. He did not. They asked if he prayed. He did not. They asked if he listened to God's word. He did not. But he offered an explanation. He said he was too old to understand such things.
He sounds like he was such the character, quite the character.
I know. Too old to understand such things, but yet he can spin all these tales of being a werewolf, all these comebacks to the judges.
Yep.
The judges decided to do a little asking around, and although many locals claimed Thiess was relatively sound of mind, they did admit that they went to him for folk magic. He would bless grains and horses. He made charms to ward off wolves, which I find is pretty ironic. He was known as a healer as well. He could make a charm that could stop someone bleeding. One of his charms involved mixing blessed salt and warm beer. The person would drink it while Thiess said, quote, "Sun and moon go over the sea. Fetch back the soul that the devil had taken to hell, and give the cattle back life and health which was taken from them." Once the judges heard that none of Thiess's charms ever mentioned God, they were doubly concerned. But not because they thought that he was insane, or because they thought that he was an actual werewolf. They thought because of his widespread reputation as a good healer, that he was a threat to Christianity. But they didn't sentence him right then and there. Instead, they brought in the local pastor, Magister Buckles, to watch over Thiess as he repented his sins. Thiess refused, saying that he himself was wise and elderly, while the pastor was a mere child. He then offered to heal wounded and sick animals to prove his point. They let Thiess go, but with a promise that his case would be brought into a higher court, and it was on October 31st, 1692. A royal district court judge named Hermann George von Trottwetter determined that Thiess was guilty of harboring diabolical delusions and, quote, vexatious and highly forbidden misdeeds. They sentenced Thiess to be flogged with 20 lashes and that he would be banished for life. He actually got off pretty easy, though, considering that other men accused of lycanthropy 100 years before him met much more gruesome ends. For example, Peter Stubb was a man who was accused of being a werewolf in Germany in 1589. Now, Stubb actually confessed under torture of having made a pact with the devil. He was publicly flayed. Then his arms and legs were broken. And just to be sure that he wouldn't come back to life, they also beheaded him and burned his body.
Jeez.
Yeah, Thiess got off pretty easy. Maybe the difference is that Thiess was never accused. He voluntarily claimed to be a werewolf. Plus, there was no evidence of him ever committing murder or other heinous crimes. Or maybe by 1691, they realized that putting people to death because of alleged lycanthropy wasn't solving their problems. Maybe he was just an old man who believed he could shapeshift with the phases of the moon. Or maybe he didn't really believe that at all. As some researchers have pointed out, maybe Thiess was just a really good con man. Either way, Thiess, or the Livonian werewolf, as he's often called, hasn't been lost to history. Several books and TV shows have kept his story alive. For example, on the TV show Penny Dreadful, the character of Ethan Chandler was loosely based on Thiess. Chandler's werewolf was also on the good side, and he fought against witches. They even referred to him as a Lupus Dei, or Wolf of God.
And that was a good show. We watched all of Penny Dreadful when it was on.
Yeah, it was a great show.
Yeah, but I had no idea that his character was based on a historical figure. And I'm wondering what Thiess would think if he knew now somehow that people were still talking about him 300 plus years later. Like, would he get a kick out of it? Would he think it's pretty cool that people are still talking about him?
Oh, I think he'd be tickled pink about it.
I think so too.
Yeah, I think he'd love the idea. I mean, he was a quite interesting man. He's the kind of guy, you go into, one of these old dive bars, and you sit down at the bar and you get a drink, and he's sitting on the bench next to you, and the old guy's just spinning all these tales and telling you, all about what he's done throughout his life. And it's, some of it's pretty outlandish, but it's so enthralling that you just can't stop listening.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? That's what Thiess reminds me of.
And I think it's interesting, too, that you had said that everybody in the village went to him for folk magic. So he was respected, too, within the village.
Right.
Which is pretty cool.
It seems to be that he was respected, or maybe they were kind of fearful of him, too.
Well, that could be.
And they just wanted to, be chums with him, just in case.
Appease the werewolf.
Right. Anyways, I would have liked to met the man.
Well, that was a cool story. I'm glad you shared that one.
Yeah, I loved it. And if you'd like to know more about tonight's stories, check out our show notes. Beth always puts them in the episode details.
Yeah, I put all the sources there so you can see where we found our information, and you can read more for yourself if you'd like to.
Well, that about wraps it up for this week's episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
I guess so.
We'll see you all next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.